He is a prominent Sri Lankan economist and public servant, widely recognized for his contribution to the field of economics, central banking, and public policy in Sri Lanka. He has held several key positions in the country's financial and economic sectors, making significant impact on monetary policy and economic development. Just to highlight a few key roles and contributions of Dr. Wijewardena, Dr. Wijewardena served as the Deputy Governor of Central Bank of Sri Lanka, and he played a crucial role in shaping country's monetary policy and financial stability. Beyond his role as at the central bank, Dr. Wijewardena has also served as an economic advisor and consultant to various government and private sector institutions. Dr. Wijewardena is also an academic, having contributed to the field of economics through research, publications, and lectures. He has written extensively on topics such as monetary policy, financial sector reforms, and economic development. He is known for his advocacy on sound economic policies and reforms aimed at promoting sustainable economic growth and development in Sri Lanka. His insights are often featured in media and public forums where he discusses current economic issues and potential solutions. Dr. Wijewardena has authored numerous articles, papers, and books on economic and finance. His writing often focuses on challenges and opportunities facing Sri Lanka's economy, providing valuable insights for policymakers, academics, and the general public. So Dr. Wijewardena remains a respected figure in Sri Lanka's economic community, known for his deep knowledge, practical experience, and commitment to the country's economic progress. So with that introduction, I would like to invite Dr. Wijewardena to do the presentation on the overall analysis of the budget and its impact on the economy and the fiscal consolidation. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Can you see the PowerPoint presentation?
We can see, sir.
You can see now. So what I do is then I will go along with the PowerPoint presentation. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my thoughts on the budget 2025 presented by President Anandakumara Dissanayake to Parliament a few days ago. The title of my topic I have selected as the Anandakumara Dissanayake AKD's budget blues and the prospects and issues. So I will just go through some of the issues involved, and at the discussion time I will permit the viewers to ask questions on what has been presented here. So normally the term budget blues means it challenges and difficulties associated with managing a budget, because it's a term that is being used by in the budget parlance. All the problems which a budget person who is preparing a budget he faces, it's called budget blues. Those problems can include the financial constraints, then unexpected expenses, and the stress of balancing incomes and expenditure. Now you will see the problems faced by President Anandakumara Dissanayake in the preparation of budget for 2025 includes all these issues. So therefore, it's actually budget blues of Anandakumara Dissanayake. So it has been the, like in the previous budgets of Sri Lanka in the post-independence period. Throughout the period, all the finance ministers of Sri Lanka faced this kind of a problem. They had the problem of preparation of the budget, problem of balancing the budget, problem of unexpected expenses creeping into the budget. Now all these problems were there, and therefore the budget is a problem, and it is called budget blues. So if we look at the financial constraints, there are two constraints faced by Anandakumara Dissanayake. One constraint is that he has agreed to go by the extended fund facility given by the International Monetary Fund to Sri Lanka without any amendment, and therefore there are certain quantitative benchmarks which the government of Sri Lanka will have to meet when it prepares its budgetary policy. And this quantitative benchmark will have to be complied by Antakumar Dissanayake in the presentation of the budget, and therefore it's one of the constraints that is heavy. The second constraints come from the Economic Transformation Act that has been enacted by Parliament just 1 month before the presidential election. In terms of this Economic Transformation Act, all future governments will have to comply with certain quantitative targets. And these targets also refer to the budget targets, and therefore the Antakumar Dissanayaka's government is also constrained by the provisions in the Economic Transformation Act. So those are statutory constraints. The previous one relating to IMF, we can call them the loan constraints. And these have to be, the budget has to be prepared within these constraints, and that's one of the problems he's facing. And we will see the budget he has presented to Parliament actually has tried to comply with the both requirements. So if we look at the some of the comparisons, if we look at revenue ratio, the revenue to GDP ratio, the IMF says it should be 15.1. The Economic Transformation Act says it should be 15% for of GDP for 2025. And the budget has simply, agreed with this particular requirement, and the budget also says the revenue target is 15.1 of GDP. So that's again a kind of a constraint, received by the government, and the government has complied with that without any question. The second one is there is again a constraint for the primary balance of the budget. We will examine later what is meant by the primary balance. The IMF extended fund facility says the primary balance for 2025 should be 2.3% of GDP. Economic Transformation Act also says that the primary balance for 2025 should be 2.3%. The budget also says its primary balance is exactly 2.3% of GDP. So the budget deficit, that is where the IMF and Antakumar Dissanayake government have differed from each other. Budget deficit, according to IMF, should be restricted to 5.2% of GDP in 2025. But the present budget of Antakumar Dissanayake exceeds this particular budget balance, and according to that budget, it's about 6.7% of GDP. So therefore, he has actually exceeded the level. So we'll have to wait and see how IMF would look at this particular instance and look at Sri Lanka's, when it comes to evaluate, make the fourth review of the external fund facility shortly, how IMF would look at this particular over performance of the budget deficit by Antakumar Dissanayake. Then the revenue structure, if you look at the revenue structure of the budget for 2025, we'll find that the total revenue of the budget is 4,960 billion Sri Lanka rupees. We can say 5 trillion Sri Lanka rupees. So that is made up of 4,590 billion by way of tax revenue, which we can say 4.6 trillion Sri Lanka rupees. The income tax comes to about 1.2 trillion. Taxes on goods and services, that is the VAT and various other taxes that have been levied on the market, 2.8 trillion. The taxes on external trade, those are the taxes on import duties on the import of goods to Sri Lanka. It's about 651 billion. Non-tax revenue 370 billion. The grants the government is expecting 30 billion. So the altogether, the government revenue is projected to be 4,960 billion. No, we can roughly say it's about, say, 5 trillion Sri Lanka rupees. Now, here we'll have to have a digression on the primary balance, because the primary balance is the one which is not being understood by many. Therefore, we'll have to have a digression on primary balance and understand what it exactly means. Now, when it comes to budgeting, the government has a revenue base where the present government is getting revenue amounting to 5 trillion Sri Lanka rupees. Then it has expenses, and expenses can be broken into several parts. One part we call the recurrent expenditure, which is being spent by the government to maintain the current public services. Therefore, we can call the recurrent expenditure as the consumption expenditure of the government. Then the government has capital expenditure, the introduction of various capital projects to Sri Lanka, like roads, buildings, power plants, reservoirs, all these, come under the capital expenditure program. That part is there. Then, in addition to that, there is another capital expenditure to be incurred by the government. That capital expenditure is called the money needed to repay the maturing public debt. For example, during 2025, there are, say, external and domestic debt numbers maturing, say, 100 rupees. That 100 rupees is included as a capital expenditure because the government has to allocate out of the budget to repay that particular amount. So the primary balance is simply we take out the repayment of the money by the government on maturing debt plus the repayment of interest on the existing public debt. And we compare the revenue of the government with the recurrent expenditure minus the interest payment. Capital expenditure, only the normal real capital expenditure except the money needed to repay the maturing public debt. The balance on that particular one, the difference is called the primary account, and if the expenditure is much more than the revenue, there's a deficit. If the expenditure is less than the revenue, we have a surplus. So what the IMF has prescribed to government of Sri Lanka, as well as what the Economic Transformation Act has prescribed to government of Sri Lanka in 2025, is that the balance on the primary account should be a surplus to the extent of 2.3% of GDP. So this is a very important thing that we have to understand. Then we now have to understand what is meant by the gross expenditure, the net expenditure, because the primary balance is concerned about the net expenditure. What we mean by net expenditure is that we take out the money needed to repay the maturing public debt out of the budget numbers, and therefore it contains only the recurrent expenditure, including the interest payments, plus the real capital expenditure, and those two, when we take them into account, we call the net expenditure of the government. Now, what is presented by the Finance Minister to Parliament is, this net expenditure. He doesn't talk about the gross expenditure, and the presumption there is that the gross expenditure doesn't matter to the government because the government can always raise new money to repay the maturing public debt, which we call the refinancing of the maturing public debt. And since there is this possibility of refinancing, that part is taken out of the budget numbers, and what is being approved by Parliament is not the gross expenditure of the government, but the net expenditure of the government. So net expenditure means the recurrent expenditure plus the real capital expenditure, except the repayment of the public debt. So this is, if you look at the budget for 2025, we find that the numbers given by the budget itself is that total receipts and other than the government borrowings is 5 trillion. Total primary expenditure, we have the recurrent and capital, about 4.2 trillion. Debt service, we have the internal interest payments and the debt repayments, about say 4.5 trillion. So we will take out the debt repayment, the provision for advance accounts, and the adjustment of book value of the existing government borrowings. When we take all these out, there's a balance of 4 trillion that has to be funded by the government. So therefore, the gross expenditure is simply 5 trillion. The net expenditure is simply 5 trillion, but the gross expenditure is 9 trillion. So the gross expenditure is about say 27% of GDP, but the net expenditure amounting to 7.2 trillion is about 22% of GDP. So what is presented to Parliament for approval is this 7.2 trillion and not the 9 trillion. Therefore, what you find in the budget numbers is expenditure as 22% of GDP, but the actual burden on the people is 27% of GDP. So the in the case of government of Sri Lanka, in 2023 and 2024, the government has attained a surplus in the primary account. How it has done it is that what it has, the government had been expected to attain this surplus by curtailing the non-interest consumption expenditure of the government. That is the payment of salaries, purchase of various services for government, and all these things are there. But how the government has attained the surplus is it has cut the capital expenditure drastically. And as a result, the surplus had been generated. So in 2023, the planned capital expenditure had been 1,220 billion Sri Lanka rupees, but what was actually spent was 933. So that's a curtailment of capital expenditure. In 2024, the curtailment has been much bigger than that. The total amount of public debt is 1,700 billion Sri Lanka rupees, the capital expenditure, but what was spent is only 817 billion. So as a result, how the government has actually generated this surplus is that it has not by curtailing the consumption expenditure of the government, but cutting down the capital expenditure. What does it mean is that all the planned construction of buildings, construction of roads, all have been, cut down to a lower level. You can easily see that when you travel along the Kandy Road to Colombo Kandy Road, you will find the expansion of the widening of the Colombo Kandy Road has been stopped. And sometimes, people are working, sometimes they don't work. Therefore, it has taken time. So that is what we mean by curtailment of capital expenditure by the government. So when you curtail the capital expenditure of the government, there are implications of the economy. The implication is simply that you are not spending enough money on account of the capital formation. Therefore, government's capital formation will become less. And when it becomes less, what would happen is that the government's contribution to economic growth is less. It's only through the private sector capital investment that we will be attaining whatever the economic growth that we are having. Therefore, we are compromising the economic growth prospects of the government of Sri Lanka over the medium to long term, because we don't spend enough money on the construction of buildings, construction of roads, reservoirs, and power plants, and so forth. So therefore, this is not a prudential budgetary policy to be adopted. But what the Ministry of Finance had done in 2023 and 2024 is exactly the same, because it is not being felt by the people immediately. It's only the analysts who might dig out this data and take it out. Even in Parliamentary Committee on Public Finance, this has not been revealed. So therefore, this will be hidden from the eyes of the members of the party. So that's not a good sign of budgeting, and therefore we'll have to be very careful about this kind of budget, because even the present budget, the total capital expenditure for 2025, the budget is what 1.3 trillion Sri Lanka rupees. Most probably to realize surplus in the primary account, the government at the end of the period might tell us that it has spent only less than 1.3 trillion Sri Lanka rupees on account of capital expenditure, therefore compromising the future economic growth. What is most important?
Doctor, sorry to bother you, Doctor. I am Lina Viksaratna. I think some slides are not visible due to a bandwidth issue, Doctor. So if you can, I think, switch off the camera, it might appear properly, Doctor.
Okay, camera should be switched off, no?
Yeah, because it takes a lot of bandwidth, no, Doctor. So
is it okay now?
Now it's clear, Doctor. You can go ahead.
Now the slides are clear, no?
Now it's clear, Doctor.
Okay. Thank you very much, because I didn't know about it. So it plans to have, what is what should be done by the government is not just to seek for a surplus in the primary account as has been reckoned by the IMF. Even Anukumar Dissanayake president has followed it without a critical view of the meaning of the primary account and what is to be done by the government. So what is to be done by the government is to have a surplus in the savings of the government. That means in the revenue account of the government. Revenue account means the government's recurrent expenditure and the government revenue. The recurrent expenditure is much more than the revenue. Then there's a deficit in the revenue account. If the income is more than the recurrent expenditure, there's a surplus. Since the recurrent expenditure is the savings of the government, any surplus is considered as a saving. And at the same time, the deficit is called, in economic terms, is called dissaving. Dissaving is the negative saving, and the government in Sri Lanka since independence had always been running a dissaving in the budget, which means the government has spent more on consumption expenditure than on the revenue of the government, and therefore there has been a deficit. And the implication of such a deficit is that the government has to borrow even to finance its consumption expenditure, which is not a prudential budgetary policy. So the revenue deficit means that the government should borrow even for the corrupt consumption and adding to the public stock of the public debt. And that is why at the time of independence, the stock of public debt was just 16% of GDP, but now it is more than 120% of GDP. That is because the government had been running a deficit in the current account, which means a dissaving. To finance even the deficit in the current account, the dissaving amount, the government has to borrow. So the borrowings have been not on account of the capital formation, borrowings have been part of the borrowing has been on account of the consumption of the government. Therefore, it has added to the capital debt stock of the government, and we are now in a bad position because of that reason. So the IMF policy is actually prescription is defective in this sense, because in my view, the IMF policy is talking about only the primary account surplus. I have seen the central bank economists, the various other people who talk about the budget, the President Anukumar Dissanayake himself, his deputy ministers on finance, and all the parliamentarians, they praise that the government has attained a surplus in the primary account. But the surplus in the primary account, as we have seen, has been attained not by the by curtailing the consumption expenditure of the government, but by curtailing the capital expenditure. So as a result, the Ministry of Finance and the IMF have simply compromised the economic growth prospects of Sri Lanka in the medium to long run, which is a very bad public policy. The budget should, therefore, another important thing that I have to mention here is that at the time of presenting the budget, everybody is, overexcited by the budget. But if you want to analyze the budget, we have to do it at the end of the period, not before the presentation of the budget, end of the period. And we have to do it ex ante, I mean, at the end of the period, how far the budget has attained its goals. So this is a very important thing. In Sri Lanka, what we normally do is we just praise the budget as it is when it has been presented, and you will be noticing that all the chambers are praising the budget as a development budget, thinking that whatever that has been promised will be implemented and will be realized, without noting that at the end of the year, when we look at the budget, the most of the proposals have not been implemented. So Sri Lanka's evaluation of the budget is very defective. We don't evaluate the budget at the end. Now, normally, people who come from the private sector like you are aware that when you present a plan, and if it is a rolling plan, when you present the plan for the next year, you always give an evaluation of the targets of the previous year, the attainments of those targets in the previous year, and if the targets have not been attained, the reasons for that, and also the remedial measures that you will be adopting in order to rectify those weaknesses. Now, this is the usual way of presenting plans, preparing plans. Now, budget is also a plan, but in the case of the budget, you will notice that none of the finance ministers talk about the past attainments of the budget, past realizations of the budget, whereas the past realizations have been defective. Not all the proposals have been, in fact, implemented, and part of the proposals have been implemented halfway through, and therefore the budget has not been able to generate the required amount of economic growth because of that reason. So this mechanism is very defective in Sri Lanka. Presently, the budget is being analyzed by the Standing Committee of Parliament called the Committee on Public Finance. And there are members, the government members as well as the opposition members in that particular committee. And what I have noted is that the members do not have the necessary technical expertise to evaluate the budget. Because when it comes to, they are just, ordinary people. I mean, you can't expect a parliamentarian to be knowledgeable of public finance, economics, and banking, and all the subjects. They come from various disciplines, and therefore, when it comes to evaluating a budget by a committee like that, it's just like a blind guiding the blind. So this is what I see in the case of the Committee on Public Finance in Sri Lanka. I mean, the questions that they ask of the public officers, specifically people who come from the central bank, those are very naive questions. So mainly because they don't have the necessary technical expertise, and therefore it applies to the budgetary evaluation also. So parliamentary control, though the parliament has the control over public finance, what we find is that the parliamentary control of public finance is also defective. And therefore, there is no any way for the members of the public like us, who pay taxes and who are expecting government to provide various services to us. We don't know how we would be able to evaluate the budget. There are private sector think tanks like Verite Research who would be producing periodical reports of the implementation of the budget targets, but those are simply financial targets. I mean, what they look at is, if the budget says that for a certain project it should spend 100 rupees, Verite Research sees whether they have the government has spent 100 rupees without looking at the outcome and the impact of the particular 100 rupees. So therefore, that part is also defective in Sri Lanka. So what is necessary for us to look at the budget in a very prudential manner, we must be able to look to assess the impact of the budget on the economy. And if somebody says the budget is a development budget, we must be able to see how far the budgetary proposals have contributed to the development of the country. And you are, at the introduction, we were told that you are interested in the investment part. So investment part, how far the investments have been generated as a result of the budget policy. So that comes out of an impact assessment study, and we don't normally do that. So the government should continue to, government does not want to privatize. Now, there are certain, in the case of Anukumar Dissanayake government, there are certain non-negotiable economic principles. So one is that the government does not want to privatize or sell state-owned enterprises. What it means is that if the government wants to keep these, enterprises under the ownership of the government, if there are losses incurred by these enterprises, the government has to fund those losses. Now, if there are capital requirements of these enterprises, the government has to provide the capital losses. Now, for example, in the case of the budget presented by Anukumar Dissanayake, the budget is allocating 20 billion Sri Lanka rupees to Sri Lankan Airlines by way of, capital expenditure program, which says that we don't want to provide any operational relief to the government, Sri Lankan Airlines. But for the entire research program, the government has we need more money spent on by the government on research. But instead, the government has spent money on the Sri Lankan Airlines, mainly because the government wants to keep that airline under the hands of the government, because that is one of the non-negotiable stand of the Anukumar Dissanayake government. Then education and health is also the government wants to maintain the education and health services under the hands of the state sector. It doesn't want the private sector to do that. So, as a result, the more and more funds will have to be allocated for this purpose in order to meet the requirements of the health sector. Okay? And the requirements of the education sector. Okay? Because the private funds are not coming. So that is again another non-negotiable stand on the top as a result of that. Then they have a drain on the income of the government, and the what we feel is that one of the non-negotiable stands of Wijewardena government is that it doesn't want to actually compromise the food security, which is a good thing. The food security should be one of the targets. Without food, our health cohesion, there will be disorder social in the country. So because of this reason, food this inflexible approach by Dissavings to certain economic principles will not stand good for Sri Lanka. My recommendation is that this should be reviewed, and if there's a necessity for the government to change its policy on the privatization of state-owned assets, change its policy on the healthcare system, education, change its policy on the participation of the private sector in food security, that has to be decided, because those things would have a very serious negative impact on the government budget, and as taxpayers we should not be ready to meet those losses arising out of those stands taken by the Wijewardena government. So the last one is the space for discussion. So I'll stop my presentation at this point, and I will participate in the discussion forum after all other presenters have made their presentations.
Okay, right. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for the insightful and a very comprehensive presentation on the budget proposals.